Welcome to Global Dispatches, a podcast about foreign policy and world affairs. I'm your host, Mark Leon Goldberg, editor of UN Dispatch. And in this show, we discuss topical global issues, have conversations with foreign affairs thought leaders and newsmakers, and give you the context you need to understand the world today. Go to globaldispatchespodcast.com to learn more. And now on with the show. Hey everyone, something a little different today. I am going to play for you my conversation with journalist Robin Wright that was recorded in December 2014. I'm bringing you this oldie but goodie for a couple of reasons. First, it was a really good conversation, and not enough of you have gone back and listened to it. In the time since I recorded that interview, the audience has increased substantially, and this is a good moment to kind of go back into the archives and take a look at that really interesting, good conversation with one of my favorite journalists working today. The second reason is more straightforward. I've been on vacation and I had an episode lined up for today, but I got called into a meeting at the State Department, actually, in which I briefed some public affairs officers about podcasts and the power of podcasting, which meant that I couldn't do the episode scheduled for release today, but it was fortuitous because it gives me the opportunity to go back and share with you this really fantastic and interesting conversation with Robin Wright. When we spoke back in December 2014, Robin Wright had just published a piece in The New Yorker, for which she is a staff writer, about a battle between Kurdish forces and Turkish forces and American forces just over the border in Syria. And she was viewing the battle from the town of Gaziantep in Turkey. And she painted this like really remarkable scene about, watching a battle unfold a few kilometers away from the safety and security of this Turkish city. It was a really kind of remarkable opening scene in a really interesting story. And so that's where we kicked off our conversation before having a longer discussion about her life and her career and some really interesting moments of history in which her life and career intersected. And my favorite part of this episode is when she talks about her time covering the war in Angola. Anyway, this episode should also serve as a useful reminder to go back and check those deep archives. If you subscribe to the podcast on iTunes, it opens up our entire archive of hundreds of episodes that go back to 2014, even some back to 2013, that are evergreen, just like this one. We talk about the life and career of the person in which I'm interviewing, and we have interesting digressions about some of the historic foreign policy events in which their life and career intersected, and this conversation, this episode with Robin Wright's a good distillation of that. All right, so here is my conversation with journalist Robin Wright from 2014.
Gaziantep has become the frontline city in southern Turkey for the Syrian war front. It's the place where the international organizations and the United States all headquarter their aid programs, their outreach to the opposition. The Syrian opposition government is now headquartered in Gaziantep. The Free Syrian Army, the umbrella group for the rebels, has its logistic office there, and they have their main meetings of commanders who come out of Syria. It's a place, though, where ISIS has its spies and its supporters. There have been cars driving through Gaziantep with ISIS bumper stickers. So everybody is in Gaziantep, and it's the place to go now in the same way that Casablanca was in North Africa during World War II, and Peshawar, the Pakistani city, was in the 1980s as the outside world was looking for a base to support the opposition to the Soviet occupation of Afghanistan.
And I like how one of your subjects that you interviewed describes a city as something like Oklahoma City, but as if it was on the forefront of an international war. I guess suggesting that it's not necessarily a cosmopolitan place, but it's a workaday sort of kind of wealthy city as well, right?
Well, it's an industrial city, but it's a very pleasant place. and it has some wonderful restaurants and very fancy new malls. It's one of the symbols of Turkey's economic progress over the past decade. The malls have, the latest movies. Brad Pitt's Fury was showing while I was there. The shopping mall it was in had an Arby's, Popeyes, McDonald's, Burger King, as well as a Starbucks, and lots of Western, European, and American stores selling Western goods. So it's a very flashy place, but it is also being a bit redefined because of the influx of Syrian refugees. And there are parts of the city that are increasingly taken over by Syrians, which has led to a kind of tension. So you see the war in Syria having its overspill effect in Gaziantep.
So one question I had leaving your piece is this. So, I mean, Turkey is like one of the stronger states in the region, right? Like a very strong central authority. Yet you have apparently like ISIS operatives operating with some impunity in the city. And you have a situation that you describe where like American contractors or American aid workers are recommended to keep a low profile. The U.S. doesn't even have like an embassy or a consulate there, even though it's such a key node in the sort of in supporting the Syrian opposition and getting aid into Syria. Americans are advised to keep a low profile. So I guess why can't the Turkish state exert its authority more effectively in Gaziantep?
Well, the Turkish police and security forces are very visible along that southern border, but at the same time, it's tough to always detect terrorists. And in the week before I got to Gaziantep, the local police force had discovered in 2 different raids more than 330 pounds of C4 plastic explosive, and one pound can kill several people, as well as a couple dozen suicide vests. And it's one thing to police a city, it's another thing to try to contain or prevent terrorism. And the U.S. government has put out 2 notices to people going to southern Turkey or to Gaziantep about the fears of extremist or militant attacks. So it's not an issue as much for the Turks, who are pretty effective. Turkey is also a member of NATO in confronting the threat. It's preventing, the kind of attacks that the United States hasn't been able to prevent either.
So how far from Kobani is Gaziantep?
Well, the frontier is actually 500 miles long, and Gaziantep is literally just over a half an hour from the border. So you have ISIS, 45 minutes away from Gaziantep. Now, Kobani is kind of laterally further away, so you have to drive a couple of hours east and then south to get to Kobani. And it's a surreal sight, I have to say, driving kind of blindly on dirt paths up to this hillside and then getting there and looking out, and there right in front of you, a few football fields away, is the war. And I got there, and about half an hour later, the first U.S. airstrike hit, and this huge mushroom cloud emerged above the city, and I could feel the reverberations because it was so close. All day long, you hear the drone of warplanes, bombers, as well as drones and intelligence aircraft flying overhead. The sound of mortars going off and automatic rifle fire, occasionally an artillery piece. And so and I sat with a group of refugees on that hillside who were passing around a pair of old binoculars to look for what was happening to their homes or their little shops. And it's a heartbreaking experience because so much of the city has now been destroyed. And the amazing fact is that the United States has now launched over 340 airstrikes on Kobani since September, and yet ISIS still controls about half the city.
I guess two quick questions. One, again, just describing the scene. So basically, they're just people gathered on a hilltop in like folding chairs watching a war, a few hundred yards away.
There are no folding chairs. Everyone sits on the ground or stands and just watches this amazing war. Usually when I cover wars, I'm in the middle of it, but this is the first time it's been almost a spectator sport, just watching this tragedy unfold in front of you.
So the other question about the Battle of Kobani is, I guess, part of the reason or of the stalemate that the Turkish government has, I guess, so far been very reluctant to let Kurdish forces reinforce the city via Turkey.
Well, the Turks have actually allowed the Iraqi Peshmerga, the Iraqi Kurds, entry through Turkey into northern Syria. But the problem and the dispute and over Turkey's role really boils down to whether the outside world is going to fight only one of the two wars playing out in Syria. The two wars are very different. The first war emerged out of the 2011 uprising by Syrian protesters demanding reforms by the government of Bashar Assad and later asking for his ouster. And that then grew into, because Assad used force against his own people, in turn turned into an insurgency and eventually a civil war. And then the second war, which has played out in the past year, is the emergence of ISIS and the militants who are predominantly taking on the more moderate rebels that the West supports. There's very little interaction, tragically or even ironically, between ISIS and the Syrian government. The rebels are having to fight both of them. And at the beginning of this year, the rebels held 4 provinces, and they lost 2 to ISIS. And over the past month, they've lost most of a third to al-Nusra, which is the faction aligned with al-Qaeda. And they're left with only 1, and they hold only part of that because the Syrian government is moving steadily around Aleppo, which is the largest city. But this gets back to your question, and that is the role of Turkey. Turkey argues that it does not want to get sucked into the war against ISIS unless the outside world is also going to fight or get involved in the war against Assad. And the United States does not want to fight the Syrian civil war, in part because of his experience for 8 years in Iraq, and knowing that it could take a very long time, cost a lot, and lead to American deaths to have boots on the ground. And you can't win a war like that without boots on the ground. And Turkey says it's not going to get involved in the war against ISIS unless the international community fights Assad. So at the moment, when you go to Kobani, you see all these Turkish tanks and artillery pieces just sitting there, and American warplanes having to fly hundreds of miles. And there are other countries as part of the coalition that are also bombing, while the Turkeys right next door are sitting and just watching.
So I guess the conclusion might be, if you draw this out a little bit, that to the extent that the non-ISIS, non-al-Nusra rebels, the Free Syrian Army or whatever you want to call it, are marginalized and are losing ground steadily, it seems, to both Assad and the Islamists, that they'll be sort of wiped out. They'll be a non-factor, and that at some point, if present trends continue, you'll have ISIS versus Assad.
Well, I don't know whether that's what's going to happen, because there's al-Nusra as well. There are well over 1,000 different militias that are fighting in Syria today. And the two most prominent militant groups are Nusra and ISIS. But there are some other Islamist movements as well. And then there are a full array of groups, some of which are under the Free Syrian Army and some that are not. And that's one of the great problems in helping the rebels that the West has supported become a more viable force, because they're so divided among themselves. And that's true not just among the militias, but politically among the opposition forces as well. And the opposition is divided in part because the Arab world itself is divided, and different countries are supporting different factions, even among the moderate rebels. So it is a political mess, just as it is a military mess.
So I wanted to switch gears a little bit and talk about you. I mean, I've been reading your work for a long time, and you're someone who's just helped me understand the world immeasurably in so many ways for so many years. So I want to actually learn a little bit about you. Where are you from?
I was born in Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I went to the University of Michigan, and I will say, go blue.
Okay. So now, since you were born there, was your family in academia?
Yes. My father was a law professor, and my mother was in the fine arts.
Oh, okay. And how, growing up, I mean, did you have any passion for journalism? Or I guess, like, what came first, your passion for journalism or your curiosity about the world?
Definitely my curiosity about the world. Journalism was a total accident. I lived in a dorm at the University of Michigan where one of the other girls there I bumped into in the hallway, and she was going off to join the student paper. And I had no interest at all. I thought journalism was kind of a blue-collar profession. And I was interested in history and science, space, physics, math, but certainly not journalism. But my father only had girls, and my father used to schlep us to all the sporting events since he had no little boys to take with him. So when my friend kept insisting I go to her to join the student paper, I thought, well, I'll go and hear what they have to say. And I thought maybe I'll see if there's just one article I can write on sports to surprise my dad and get back to him after all he put us through as kids. And so I went along, I wrote the first article, I loved it, and I ended up as the first female sports editor of a student paper in this country.
Do you remember what the article was about?
No, I don't, actually. Isn't that funny? It was probably about football because it was the fall, almost certainly football because it was the beginning of the fall. And I tended to write about football, basketball, and baseball, the three big sports, occasionally wrestling and some of the others. But and I ended up doing a lot of photography of sports as well. And I did a history degree in the end and went on to grad school, but to earn, money for school, I worked on the student paper every night. Michigan had its own building, its own paper. We put out a full-scale paper that could be as much as 32 pages. And it's different these days, but back then we had our own linotype machines and everything. And then my junior and senior year, I worked on the city paper in the morning because it was better than waiting tables or working at a department store or something, and I had more fun.
That was like the Ann Arbor city paper?
The Ann Arbor News.
Ann Arbor News, okay.
And then so I, as an internship in the summer after school, before I went to grad school, I got an internship on the paper in Boston called the Christian Science Monitor.
Of course.
And I had a wonderful time working, doing big pieces. I even made the front page. And they invited me back when I finished grad school. And I decided it was so much fun that why not? So my life is a total accident.
Well, so the Christian Science Monitor does, excellent international coverage. First, what did you go to grad school for? And what year are we talking about? Like, when did you graduate grad school, just to try to peg this?
I graduated. My undergraduate degree was in 70, and my graduate degree was in 71.
And did you get a history degree, or is it a journalism degree?
Yes. No, it's history.
What did you study? Like, what was your history interests?
Oh, I had a whole range of them.
Did you have to do like a master's thesis?
Yes, and the funny thing is, I'm just trying to remember what it was. It was so long ago. But my interest in, I was very lucky. My interest in international affairs began when my father took his sabbatical, and I was in the 8th grade, and he was doing a series of books with the ministers of finance of what was then the common market, the European common market, now the European Union. And so he put my sister and me in a boarding school where we had just a wonderful array of students from around the world.
In Brussels or Strasbourg?
No, this was in Switzerland.
In Switzerland, okay.
Yeah, they moved around every month to a different country, and so they put us in a school in Switzerland. And I remember listening to the trial on the BBC of Adolf Eichmann with the daughter of an Israeli member of the Knesset and the daughter of a Lebanese prime minister, and learning about the Middle East. And that was quite an introduction. And I met, a wonderful Nigerian student who, American students had so little training on the rest of the world. Remember, this was a time when the empires were still just beginning to be dismantled. And I remember saying to him, what does your house look like in Nigeria? How do people live? And he looked at me with a twinkle in his eye and he said, "Oh, we live in a treehouse, of course." And I thought about that for a moment, and I said to him, I'm in the 8th grade, and I said, "Well, what do you use, for facilities for the toilet?" And he said, "Oh, we, of course, use the bush." And I looked at him and I said, "Well, that seems very inconvenient." And he said, "No, not at all. We use the lift," meaning the elevator. And, of course, he was teasing me. And I realized I never wanted to be ignorant about Africa again, because at that stage we all learned about Africa through the empires, whether it's the Belgians, the Portuguese, or the French, or the Germans, or the Brits. And so my first 7 years as a foreign correspondent were all in Africa.
So how did you sort of get to Africa? What countries did you first land in when you had your first sort of gig as a foreign correspondent?
Well, the first country, in 1973, I was on my way to Iran, and I stopped in Beirut on the way. We used to have to hop, skip, and jump all over to get anywhere. And I remember landing, and someone said, "The Egyptians have crossed the Suez Canal." This was in 1973, and it was the day the October War broke out. And then I went on to Iran, which of course was during the Shah's era. And
wait, so you're you're in
I used to
Beirut.
travel around. I used to be kind of fireman when there was or I'd travel to do features. Mm-hmm. And my first, I'm trying to remember my very first trip. 1974, I had a wonderful trip where I drove from Algiers to Dar es Salaam it was Algeria, Nigeria, Chad, Cameroon, the Central African Republic, a country then called Zaire, now known as the Congo, Rwanda, Tanzania, and Kenya. And it took 4 months, and only 3 of those nights did I spend in a hotel. The rest of the time, I camped out. And
who were you with? Was this part of did you do this alone, or were you with a team or someone? That sounds like an amazing trip.
It was phenomenal. Of course, you couldn't do it today because of wars and illnesses and so forth. But I had a wonderful time, and I wrote a series about trekking across Africa and kind of the things that were changing the continent. And
does anything particular stand out from that series? Like, do you remember like a scene etched in your mind to this day?
Oh my God, yes. I camped in the Mountains of the Moon, where Livingston and Stanley bumped into each other, and had exchanges with pygmies, and there was no language we could speak. I'd brought all kinds of things to trade with people along the way, and I traded a couple of bottles of nail polish for a little bow and arrow, and the bow had on it the tail of a monkey dangling down. But just the exchange was extraordinary. And a year later, I actually, by accident, was on my way to Tunisia and was on the flight carrying Muhammad Ali. And he had been to North Africa, but never to Sub-Saharan Africa. And he was going to fight the Rumble in the Jungle with George Foreman. And when I walked up to him and told him that I was fascinated by this fight because I'd just come through Zaire, and I had seen all the posters for the Ali fight. And so he demanded that I be brought up from coach and that I sit next to him on the flight and tell him all about Africa. And I said to him, make me famous as a sports reporter, write me a poem. And off the top of his head, he said, you think people were surprised when Nixon resigned? You just wait till I whip Foreman's behind. And so I've had some wonderful.
Did you write about that experience
with Ali?
With Ali, yeah.
Well, the funny thing is, when I got off, we flew to Paris, and I was going to Tunis, and then he was flying on to Zaire, again in days when you couldn't take a direct flight. And I called the Christian Science Monitor, and I said, I've got this great story, and he was trying to avoid the press, and I just happened to be on his flight, and I have all this, stuff. He got up and he demonstrated the punch he developed for the fight called the Ghetto Whopper, and he introduced me to Don King and Angelo Dundee, who were his trainer and his manager, and it was an amazing, trip. He told me he brought all his own water and food on the flight because he didn't want to get the trots that might weaken him for the fight. And but it turns out that the Monitor did not cover boxing in the same way it didn't cover hunting. And so the three pieces I'd hoped to write out of the piece, I wrote one, and that's why the Ali fight was important for the cohesion or the creation of a sense of nationalism in Zaire, a country that was still deeply divided along tribal and linguistic lines.
I love that you can recite the poem that Ali created for you on the spot. I guess it's not something you would soon forget.
Yeah, and that was 1974.
That's just an amazing story. I'm like, I have an ear to ear grin listening to this story. So how long were you with the Christian Science Monitor?
Well, I got a fellowship in 1975, which took me to Africa for a year, and to write about the end of the Portuguese Empire, which really opened up a third of southern Africa, with Angola and Mozambique, but it also kind of lit a fire under Rhodesia and Namibia and South Africa. And so I ended up for 7 years covering the wars of the region. And I was in Soweto the day the first black mass uprising began in Soweto in 1976.
Well, actually, can I stop you there? What brought you to Soweto that day? Did you know that the uprising was about to happen? Well, I mean, the uprising started, and I just hightailed it. I lived in Johannesburg then, and Soweto's on the outskirts, so I just got in a car and raced out there, and then spent the next 18 months in and out of the townships as this protest that started literally by school kids as they poured out of their schools after the government announced they had to change the language of education from languages they spoke to the language called Afrikaans, which is a derivative of the white settlers, the Dutch settlers, that most kids didn't speak. And it very quickly became very bloody, and that day several kids were shot in the back. Did you witness these shootings?
Some of them. I saw the kids afterwards. I didn't see the immediate opening fire, but I saw, I got caught up in the tear gas and, everybody running in all directions and the security forces moving in, and I can still see it in my eye.
I guess, how do you, as a reporter, approach this kind of brutality, like government-sponsored brutality? Do you try to, have a sense of detachment to it, or how is that even possible when you're, dealing with kids who have been shot in the back by state forces?
Well, as a reporter, to have credibility long-term, you have to play it pretty straight. The facts tell the story. And I always believe in quoting both sides. And so I would tell the stories of the victims, and then I would get the comments of the government. And as a human being, you don't need to say anything because it's so obvious that in this case there was excessive, unnecessary, and deadly force used against a bunch of school kids who were in their school uniforms and had no weapons with them.
And so, for how long in total were you in Africa in the 70s?
7 years. I covered the Rhodesian Civil War, that now Zimbabwe. I covered independence in both Mozambique and Angola, the end of their civil wars, and or their uprisings against colonial rule, and then the civil wars that followed. I covered the civil war in Namibia, in the Horn of Africa. Trying to think of other wars.
And so what was your next move? Like, what compelled you? What made you want to leave Africa at the time?
Well, the last thing I did was interview Mugabe the day after he was elected. And I realized then that it was going to be a long time before South Africa played out. And that either I spent the rest of my life in Africa or I moved elsewhere. And by that point, I'd moved from the Christian Science Monitor to the Washington Post, and then from the Washington Post to CBS. And so I said to CBS, it's time to move. And they offered me Rome. So I spent the next year and a half, just over that, traveling around the world with Pope John Paul II. And there were great adventures there.
What was your first trip with Pope John Paul II?
Oh, you're asking all these sequential questions. I have to think hard.
Well, you don't have to answer sequentially. You can.
Well, I did some amazing trips. We did.
Yeah. What were one of the sounds that stand out to you?
We went to Brazil, and I remember him. This was at the height of the military dictatorship, standing in an auditorium with hundreds of thousands of labor union workers, raising his fist in the air, shouting Solidarność, Solidarność, which was the name of the Polish labor union that took on the Polish communist government and forced it to cede power, the first one in Eastern Europe. And what he was doing was encouraging the labor unions in Brazil to be a force against the military dictatorship there. And they were. That was the amazing thing. I watched him trigger these amazing changes, historic changes. He did the same thing in the Philippines. I was the pool reporter inside when he confronted Ferdinand Marcos and said that he had empowered the church to be the pulpit for the opposition, which was something he didn't often allow. And that was the turning point that really led ultimately to the ouster of Ferdinand Marcos and his famous wife Imelda. Everywhere we went, he had some profound impact on the political scene. And it was great fun going back in 1994, more than a dozen years later, and traveling with him on his first trip to what had been the Soviet Union after the change. And his mother was Lithuanian, and so his first stop was in the former Soviet Republic of Lithuania, now the independent country of Lithuania.
So that's so interesting too. I mean, so I'm 33 years old, and like my memories of Pope John Paul are like that of kind of like a frail old man. But you hear these stories, like you tell, of him having this transformative effect around the world, and so it's just kind of striking for me to hear that from you.
Oh yes, he was really incredibly dynamic, and we used to have these discussions on the plane. He would come back and talk to all of us and who traveled with him. And I was the only woman on the plane at that point. And he was very kind. We'd have these amazing conversations about, even the Vatican's policy on birth control. And he had a revolutionary idea in some ways. He was the first pope to really say that sex was for more than procreation, that sex taught a man and a woman love, and understanding love brought them closer to understanding the love of God. And so I would ask him about when we went to the Philippines and he was speaking out against birth control. When the demographics and the poverty would think it was time to recognize that it was much smarter to allow birth control. And he kept making the point that the act of making love should be just that. It should not be an act of lust. It should be an act of conscious love, and that there should be deliberation in whether and a consciousness about whether you wanted to create a child or, a sensitivity. And so it was a way of, it's kind of reflected what was known as the rhythm technique within the church. But he was very candid about some of the trickiest issues. And remember, this is the early 80s. This is, women's lib had only just taken off in the 70s, and the pill in the 60s. And he was a fairly candid guy. I loved having conversations with him.
A good interview.
A great interview.
So you were in Rome for about a year, you said?
About a year and a half, and then I had a case of sexual harassment by my bureau chief. It's a long story. I didn't like it, but I decided it was time to go back to print. And what I really love, the problem with television is that if you don't have pictures, then you don't have a story. And people just don't take words. And that, it's one thing to cover a coup d'etat or war, but to have to cover, earthquakes and the eruption of a Mount Etna, was not my thing. So I decided that I'd been going in and out of the Middle East for quite a while, and that it was time to go back. And so I joined the Sunday Times of London and based myself in Beirut in the early 1980s, and was there for 5 years. And this was during the Civil War, the Israeli invasion, the rise of Hezbollah. Several of my friends were taken hostage by Hezbollah during that period.
So this was pretty much right when the height of the civil war in Lebanon, right?
Yes. And I covered not just Lebanon, but I did the whole region. I actually had covered the Iranian Revolution and the hostage crisis. I was in Algiers the moment the hostages were released, and was standing at the foot of the steps of the plane covering their arrival to freedom in 1980.
So how, I spoke to Octavia Nasser for one of these interviews, and she was covering the Lebanese Civil War at the time, the former CNN reporter. I guess in such a fractious environment, in divided Beirut, how do you actually go about doing your job? It seems so incredibly difficult. It's difficult to be a war reporter at any time, but in such a city that's divided neighborhood by neighborhood between armed groups where, reporters are sometimes victims and getting, kidnapped and killed. How do you do what you're sent there to do?
Oh, I don't know. I think at some point you begin to develop instincts about where to go, how to do things, what's dangerous, how far are you willing to go. I have been incredibly fortunate because I've had some very, very close calls, incredibly close calls, and a lot of my colleagues haven't made it. I've lost friends in the Syrian war, too many, and in Lebanon. But when I covered the war in Angola, I went in with, I believe in covering all sides of a war. I don't do just, our side. In fact, I make a point of trying to go to the other side so that that I understand a conflict, that I know both sides, and I'm not, shaped my reporting just because one side is allied with the United States or the United States is involved. And so I'd covered all three sides of the Angolan Civil War, but in the north I went in with one pro-Western faction that had hired British mercenaries. And I was in the town with the British mercenaries, last town held by this group, and the Cuban-backed Angolan forces moved in to this town, which is on the mouth of the Congo River where it meets the Atlantic, and there was no way out. So everyone raced down to the river, and this is flows right into the ocean. So it was not like little stream of river. This is mighty Congo River, and there was a terrible storm, and there was only a little tugboat by the dock. And so it's a town of 350 people, and everybody was trying to hang on to this little tugboat that was so small it made the African Queen, if you've ever seen the Humphrey Bogart movie, look like a riverboat cruiser. I mean, this little tugboat was tiny. And from the weight of the humans trying to grab onto it, it capsized. I was in the tiny little cabin, and we all went into the drink. And by that point, the forces were on the beachfront, on the shore, firing at us in the middle of the storm. So people on both sides of me got hit, went down, pools of blood were everywhere. It was awful. And the mercenaries eventually got the tugboat uprighted, and it set off under fire across the mouth of the river to the Congo. And out of 350 people, only 22 of us made it out alive. So there were a lot of close calls.
Yikes. Wow. So I guess, how do you process something like that? I mean, how do you reflect on that and sort of understand what just happened?
Well, some of them are like out-of-body experiences, to be honest with you. When you look back on them, I did a prison stint in Angola because I went back to the capital to cover the trial of the mercenaries who were captured at that town, and ended up the government wanted me to be a witness against them, and I said, I'm an observer, not a participant. I have a visa as a journalist. You can introduce my articles, but I'm not part of this process. And because I refused to testify, they put me in jail, interrogated me, and so forth. That's another long story. But
how long were you in Angola jail for?
Long enough. And anyway, so every time this happens to me, I say, I'm not doing this anymore. I should learn my lesson. I've had enough. My body's been battered and bruised, and I've been scared out of my mind, and I always think this is the last time. And I keep doing it, and I think it goes back to the fact that I love history. I'm witnessing history as it happens. It's such a privilege. I'm a little girl, an absolute nobody from Ann Arbor, Michigan, and I've had access to some of the most notorious and famous people in the world. I've traveled with almost every president since Jimmy Carter and every Secretary of State since Henry Kissinger. I've interviewed Idi Amin and Muammar Gaddafi, and I've also traveled with the Pope and interviewed Nelson Mandela. So I've seen, it's been a great adventure of my life.
I mean, I could talk to you for hours about this, but I won't keep you for hours. Can I ask, what are your current research focus? What are your current reporting projects? Anything you want to tease out or just kind of plug?
Oh, you never know with my life. Kind of depends on what happens. I'm going next week to be an international observer in the Tunisian presidential election.
Excellent. I mean, one success story so far of the Arab Spring.
We'll see. The two final candidates for president, one is an 87-year-old former foreign minister for the ancien regime, the autocrats, and the other is the president who emerged after the uprising. And so we see a contest here between the old ways and the new, and we'll see if the kind of Egypt syndrome plays out in Tunisia now too.
And are you an election observer, or are you to observe? Oh, well, so not you're not going to be reporting. You're going to be.
Well, who knows? I may write something out of it. As I say,
okay.
You never know with me.
All right. Thanks all. We will be back next week with some more original content. Bye.